Okay, so we are in week 2 of budget hearings, and week 2 started off really with a bang, right? So, Department of Education, what was that like?
Well, it was a very long day for a Monday, talking with Dr. Carrie Rowe, the Secretary of the Department of Education. We spent a lot of time on education, as we should, because it is fundamentally important to the Commonwealth, fundamentally important to our students and their families and our communities.
Sure, absolutely. And in terms of the governor's budget itself, this is pre-K through 12 education is almost 35% of the overall spend.
Yeah, the education budget portion is the second largest chunk of the Pennsylvania budget behind human services. So it's something that we do have to pay a lot of attention to. We have to talk about the significant increases that the governor has proposed once again for the education budget. We're looking at a total of roughly over $900 million in an increase after a year that we already dedicated historically high funding for education. So there should be some concerns with that.
So the increases the governor's been proposing, a lot of this has been centered around, of course, that the lawsuit from a couple of years ago, and then what followed was the Basic Education Funding Commission, and then last year, as part of the budget negotiations, a formula was reached, which was, partially driven through block grants to schools to cover that adequacy gap. So what was your kind of perspective on that, of how this adequacy gap is addressing what some have called a systemic underfunding of schools?
Well, I think it's kind of ironic because they came up with this formula based on trying to address the adequacy gap, yet some of the districts in the school districts in my district aren't getting hardly anything, hardly enough to even pay for one person's wages, while other districts in other parts of the states are getting significant increases. So I don't understand how this formula is fair or equitable to any school district. And in fact, some of my districts have even complained about it to me. But looking at the governor's budget proposal, as I said, an over $900 million increase, supposedly to address this adequacy gap, a large chunk of that going into the Ready to Learn block grants. But what's alarming to us is the fact that the governor is only proposing that for the 25-26 budget. Even with that, there's still, based on the court decision, $3.5 billion funding that needs to occur to address that quote-unquote adequacy gap. Yet the governor has nothing in the basic education funding or in the Ready to Learn block grants for the foreseeable future. So are we addressing the problem this year completely, or are we not?
Sure. So what you're saying is that the governor is committing to funding for this year, but he's not looking to the future. This is a kind of a Band-Aid, we're going to address it this year, but he's not presenting you with a forward-thinking plan when it comes to the adequacy gap, dealing with this court case, and driving education funding out moving forward.
Absolutely, and there are really two concerns with that. One is the fact that to even balance this year's budget, the governor is proposing to deplete our surplus and draw down the rainy day fund, and that essentially leaves us with nothing. The other side of that is the secretary herself admitted you cannot continue to throw money at a problem and think it's going to fix itself. That's what we have been saying. Like, we continue to channel billions and billions of dollars to education, and we want to make sure every child has the best opportunity for a quality education, no matter where they are in this Commonwealth. But when you look at historical data, education funding has increased 50% in the last 10 years, at a time when student populations have declined. So what are we doing wrong? Again, to what the secretary said, we need to start looking at how these funds are being used, how they are delivering a quality education for students, and to make sure, again, that every student has an opportunity for a quality education. And maybe this traditional educational model isn't the only way. And I think a lot of people agree. We start talking about school choice and alternatives to public education. And trust me, I'm a big proponent of public education because that's what I have in Indiana County. That's where all my kids went. But I understand not everyone is the same. So we need to look at how we're delivering education, how we're utilizing these funds, because we cannot continue to throw millions and billions of dollars into a system that's failing.
Sure, and let's take a look at exactly what the PD Secretary said. Representative Marcy Mostello from Butler County asked this question of the budget of the PD Secretary.
Can you please cite exact examples of where making a higher investment is showing better test results?
So I don't know that we can say that there's a one-to-one correlation, that simply adding money is going to beget immediately higher test scores. I think it's a more complicated issue than simply adding additional funding.
So very interesting response there. You just kind of talked about this. There's no one-to-one ratio with more dollars equals better test scores.
Right.
And so what I find interesting is before we watch that clip, you talked about how your school districts in rural Pennsylvania are not seeing big increases in funding from the adequacy gap, the Ready to Learn block grants. There are some school districts that are, and apparently it's not working.
It's not working, clearly. If we continue to have to channel millions and millions of dollars to education, and we're not seeing improvements, we're not seeing improved test scores, we're not seeing these schools that are failing in urban areas, deliver for the students, then what are we doing? We're clearly doing something wrong. And I believe that that's what the secretary was saying. We can't just continue to funnel money and think the problem's going to solve itself. So that's why during the course of the hearing yesterday, we started asking for more accountability. What are you doing, Madam Secretary, to fix this problem?
Sure, absolutely. And I think that everyone there was a little taken back at her response, because that was really the first time that we've heard anyone from the Democrat side blatantly say, well, no, we're not seeing the results from these test scores. And there's no longer can blame it on COVID, right? I mean, we're well out of that. So I think that was a groundbreaking moment yesterday to have that conversation where the PD secretary is on the record stating a Republican talking point. More money is not just going to fix this. It's a bigger problem.
Well, I think she's simply being honest. She's been in education her entire career. She was a superintendent in the Beaver County area. So she understands, what it takes to deliver a quality education. And I appreciate the fact that she was being honest, because I think more and more people are starting to realize that. And I think that it's something that fundamentally will change education, because I think everyone, and I said this on the floor yesterday, everyone needs to come together to solve this problem. It can't be a partisan issue. We all need to work together, because ultimately we're working for the students of this Commonwealth and their families. And if we're not using taxpayer dollars in the most efficient and effective way that we can, then we are going to continue to fail these students and their families, and we cannot allow that to continue.
Sure. Let's switch gears a little bit here. We're going to play a clip from Representative Ryan Warner from Fayette County, and he's going to talk a little bit about school district reserves.
One of the things that I find very hypocritical about the governor's budget proposal is that he has absolutely no issue in completely spending down the state's rainy day fund and our surplus budget. However, we have school districts that are now sitting on $6.8 billion in reserve funding, but wants to make sure that that stays in place while we wipe away our surplus funds for every other asset of our budget.
So, that's $6.8 billion estimated right now in collective school district reserves. It's not to say there's no one school district sitting on that, but throughout the Commonwealth, some school districts have more, some school districts have less. But what's really interesting is the governor's not taking this into account in his funding.
Right.
Yet at the same point in time, he wants to use our reserves, right, and drain our rainy day fund.
Well, absolutely, and I think that we need to understand, how much some of these school districts have, how much is too much. You need to have a reserve balance. You need to have money in the event something happens. And in some cases, districts need money for capital projects and things like that. But conversely, the governor is saying, and it's the irony, I guess, is that the secretary literally said drawing down your reserve funds and your rainy day funds would be, quote, irresponsible. Yet that is what Governor Shapiro is proposing to do with our own state budget. So which is it?
Budgeting for thee, but not for me.
Right, yeah. I mean, clearly, and I think that most people who even have a budget for their household wouldn't drain their savings to go on vacation, right? You're going to have something in reserve to pay your bills. And at a time when families are struggling to make ends meet, when eggs are $10 a dozen and people can't pay their utility bills, we got to start being more responsible with taxpayer dollars. And the fact that the governor wants to wipe out our reserves, wipe out the rainy day fund, where are we going to draw from these funds in the future? It's going to force someone to make some hard decisions about taxes, and we don't want to be there because we don't feel that we need to be there.
and it seems too that a lot of the school districts that are low on reserve funds are those rural school districts that are already not seeing the increases that you'd be looking for. I mean, I think everyone understands reserves are a good thing, right?
Yeah,
you need
absolutely.
to have somewhere between around that 20% number. The irony, of course, is that the Secretary stated that these school districts need that reserve in case the General Assembly doesn't pass a budget, right? You know,
yeah.
and these things make sense, but you have to look at this as from a holistic picture. The Pennsylvania budget is not just a series of agencies and requests and giving out money. It's a holistic problem, and that's why you're here for 3 weeks to talk to every agency so you can make a global decision, not just a agency by agency decision.
Well, that's right. And, you know, I understand that these districts need their reserves, but at a point where we're talking about almost $1 billion in additional funding for education, is it necessary? You know, if these districts, and I think we need to take a deeper dive into who has what, you know, how much they have in reserve, why they have this much in reserve. You know, if they have that much in reserve, do we really need to be providing another almost $1 billion in education? And most of that going to the Ready to Learn block grant in this case. So I think it's something that, and I believe the Secretary actually said, in agreement that there needs to be more accountability. We need to understand where these taxpayer dollars are going and how they're being used, because we cannot continue to throw money at problems and think they're going to fix themselves.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, we've proven time and time and time again, more money does not fix the problem.
Right.
Interestingly enough, though, there is a problem that money can fix, and that has to do with school facilities. So we have seen the reports. Sometimes you've even toured the schools where they have lead paint, they have asbestos, they have a boiler that doesn't work. There are absolutely infrastructure problems at schools, which is why we have a school facilities improvement line item.
Right.
But you uncovered some interesting things. We're going to watch a clip here by Representative Eric DeVanzo from Westmoreland County, who he kind of discovered something this week.
What I want to discuss is the public schools facilities improvement line. The governor's given another $25 million. We'll do $125 million. A specific line item, and there's a Solar for Schools program. Is that a program that the Department of Education supports and advocates for?
It is something that we would support any technical assistance or and provide any resources that are necessary, but that particular program isn't something that's within the Department of Education.
Yeah, correct. It falls DCED or CFA, I believe. So it is something that you guys support, correct? You guys would advocate for?
As far as advocate for, I can see the benefits related to teaching students about alternate energy sources and providing technical assistance related to the program itself.
Okay, but as far as there's no study out there that shows that putting solar panels on the rooftops of schools, that child gets a better education, correct?
I think I can safely agree that there's no study that says if you put a solar panel on your roof, students will do better.
All right, so this program then, you know, we're taking an additional $25 million, and we're kind of taking away from education. We're putting it in the solar panels, so to speak. Do you know how much of that money out of the 125 is there a specific line that's like designated for solar? Any ratio by any chance?
I don't know the answer to the ratio, but what I can say is that the governor's proposal isn't solely about education. There is a more global impact, and there are a lot of competing reasons why one would move forward with something like a solar program.
Yeah, there's a recent study, the Penn Environmental Report, 91% of Pennsylvania schools have lead pipes. Students are getting contaminated lead exposures. I'm just wondering why, and I think we would all agree, right? Getting lead pipes out of our schools is more important than putting solar panels on the rooftops here.
I think they are both important. I would agree with you that getting lead out of our water and asbestos out of the floors and the walls so that students have a safe and healthy learning environment is of utmost importance.
Yeah, my main concern with these solar panels is, and we've heard it here this morning all the way across the board, funding. We just can't get enough money. And so when these solar panels go onto the rooftops in 20 years, when these panels whenever their time's up or they're expired, do we have any idea who's going to pay to remove these panels? Will this cost go back onto the taxpayers?
Well, I think what we want to consider is the fact that the solar panels proposed are to reduce the cost of implementing solar energy for schools. And the specifics of the guidance and guidelines for this program, I think, may be better addressed by DCED.
We had mentioned cutting cost. Do you guys, I couldn't find anything that showed there's actually a cost savings with these solar panels. Do you guys have anything that you could share with us?
Again, I think this might be something that's better addressed with DCED, but when you take something that is naturally occurring and are able to capture it and convert it using the solar panels, and thereby you need less of something that you have to pay for as a commodity, you will just by that logic and by its rationale reduce the costs.
Yeah, I think getting back to my point, the concern is the removal of these panels. We're seeing people that are, when their panels are done at their home, they're taking them out, taking them to the garbage. These panels are full of nickel. That nickel's getting into everybody's water systems, and we're seeing contamination there.
I appreciate your concern with the environment, and I absolutely share your concern. I would assume that the guidance that DCED has would address what happens at the end of life.
Very interesting stuff, huh?
Well, it certainly is. I understand the need for grants to help school facilities, and we had allocated $100 million to that fund, and now the governor is proposing an additional $25 million. But instead of fixing things like lead lines in school districts, failing buildings and infrastructure, he's proposing that money to go to solar panels. Mm-hmm. Nothing against solar, but at a time when our school districts have more fundamental infrastructure needs, I think that's misplaced use of taxpayer dollars.
And I think, too, it's a little bit ironic that he's willing to spend money on solar panels, but yet he refuses to withdraw from RGGI,
right,
the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which ultimately is driving up the cost of electricity.
Absolutely.
So if these schools are having trouble with their electricity costs, it's not because they don't have solar panels. It's because they...
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, if the governor would just step away from this excessive environmental policy that taxes energy production, we would see energy costs decrease. And, at a time when school budgets are stretched as they are, I think lowering their energy costs would go a lot further than giving them money to put in solar panels.
Yeah, and you're not going to do that by just putting some solar panels on roofs. That's not going to ultimately make electric bills that much cheaper, right? There's really very little evidence that supports that these schools with solar panels are running entirely on solar, right?
Right.
We know the efficacy of these solar panels, and then also I think Representative Anzo talked about the disposal of these solar panels, and that's a whole other issue in and of itself.
Well, it certainly is. Once these school districts install these solar panels, if they put them on their roof, they basically have a lifespan of about 20 years. Then what happens? That's a big issue in the disposal of these solar panels because they do contain chemicals that need to be addressed. So I think that's a concern these school districts have to take into consideration when they're going down this path. But again, to me, it's not about solar panels. It gets back to the basics of what these school districts actually need and the purpose for these grants. And it should be to make improvements to the buildings themselves because that ultimately has to do with the health of the students.
Absolutely. A couple other interesting things that came up. Career and technical education was asked about by Representative Kristen Marcel, specifically asking if there is a wait list to get into these programs, because we understand that there is. What are your thoughts on the commitment of the administration for career and technical education? Well,
I think you could always do more for career and technical education, and I think one of the hang-ups, which I've had some discussions with my local districts who have career and tech education, is some of the the hang-ups in the school code don't even allow them to offer some of the classes that they would like to ask. So I think the Department of Education could step in some ways to actually make it easier for schools to deliver career and technical education. But again, I think there's another bit of irony in the fact that the governor is underfunding community colleges, right, that offer those types of trade options for adults. So, you know, I get frustrated at times in these hearings because you see a lot of money thrown around, and a lot of it really doesn't make any sense when you actually look at it from a practical perspective that would make a difference in people's lives.
And that's why it's so important what you do, your job as appropriations chairman, because I mentioned it earlier, but each agency comes before you, and they're worried about their line items and what they're doing, but you have to look at this globally. You have to look at the big picture. And so, you know, at the end of the day, pre-K through 12 education, extremely important.
Absolutely.
What they're doing is extremely important. But it all has to fit together. It's all a big puzzle. You know, and one of the things I've heard you harp on, I think every hearing you've used this word, is accountability.
Yes.
Is there one thing that you would like to see improved in accountability for the Department of Education this year that you think could maybe be a part of this conversation with them moving forward?
Well, I think we need to know what these funds are being used for, how they're being used, and are they resulting in student improvements? Are they improving the educational quality for these students? What are they being used for? And they can't answer that question. And that's where I think accountability has to come in. At a time when the governor is proposing a $51.5 billion budget, $3.5 billion spending increase, I think taxpayers want to know this information too. I think we deserve to let them know. They deserve to know where their taxpayer dollars are going, what they're being used for, particularly when it comes to their own children.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much. Another episode of the Struzzi Scoop, and we'll be back some more with budget hearings galore because we've got 3 weeks of them, and there's a lot of things to cover and a lot more to talk about. So we'll get there in the near future.
All right. Thanks, everyone.